This video essay and others like it has been brought to you by Patreon. Shout out to my contributors, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. As for everyone else, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and share with your neighbors on social media. Thank you again, and on to the video. With the 2024 election just around the corner, American progressives will soon enough be trying to rationalize each and every way that they can in order to convince everybody, including themselves, that their continued support of the Democratic Party is justified. And the rationalizations that they typically employ include the following. Number 1. If we can get a more left-leaning politician in office, then we could potentially pressure them further left through the use of activism and advocacy, as though it will be easier for us to push for these things under a Democratic administration compared to a Republican administration. Number 2. We shouldn't support third parties because they don't have the support to pose a legitimate threat. Therefore, we should vote for the Democrats since they're the only show in town and they're not as overtly damaging to the working class as the Republicans are. Number 3. Even if a third party did pose a substantial threat and possessed for itself the clout and the influence needed to win the election, we should still support the Democrats regardless of the facts that they are sellouts and enemies of the working class. Otherwise, we will risk splitting the vote and handing the election over to the Republicans, who, as we all know, are basically Hitler. But make no mistake, viewer, the politics of being a left-leaning person who votes for and supports the Democrats simply because there is no viable alternative at this time, and they're not as overtly bad as the Republicans, is the politics of defeat. The politics of capitulation. It is, in fact, the politics of a coward. The reason for this is because these people are acquiescing to their class enemy without even attempting to put up a fight, as the general electoral strategy of the Dems is to, at the very least, appear to be not as bad as the Republicans on the surface, while snubbing and eschewing actual progressive policy since 1. Adopting said progressive policy would mean alienating their wealthy donors who bankroll their electoral campaigns, and 2. They have no incentive whatsoever to carry out leftist reforms since they're already secure in the vote. All they need to do is pay lip service to progressive reform and remind us why we need to vote for them because they're not Republicans. In this way, the Democratic Party's central campaign strategy is essentially a form of blackmail, the good old-fashioned carrot in the stick, so to speak, i.e., vote for us, despite the fact that we don't actually represent you, we're constantly lying to you and have nothing to offer for you, or don't vote for us and face the consequences. Ooh, Republicans bad, so scary. Republicans fascist, fascism bad, therefore vote me. And yet the Democrats are bankrolled by big wealthy millionaires and billionaires just as the Republicans are. They are both anti-socialist, anti-working class parties that perpetuate racism and imperialism across the globe, and the Democrats are under no legal obligation to uphold any of the promises that they made to the constituency on the campaign trail. Just look at the Biden administration's response to the railway workers' strike, when the overworked, overexploited railway workers were demanding 2 weeks of paid time off by law, despite the facts that paid time off by law, along with mandatory paid sick leave and mandatory paid maternity leave, were one of Joe Biden's major campaign promises. The response from Biden's government was to first water down the original proposal from 14 days down to 1 day, to which, to my knowledge, they didn't even get that, and then immediately following up by passing laws making the strike illegal. I repeat, despite being a major selling point of his campaign platform, Biden's response to the railway workers was to outright reject their demands on the spot and then turning around and declaring the strike illegal. Let us examine some of Biden's other major campaign promises that he failed to deliver on. Despite promising to codify Roe v. Wade, he instead sat idly by as the Supreme Court killed this very crucial piece of civil rights legislation. Isn't it funny how in the months leading up to the 2020 general election, that we were getting a slew of rhetoric from the Chomskyites desperately belaboring the points that we can't let the Republicans win, lest they pack the Supreme Court with far-right justices, only for Biden to let said justices have their way regardless. He also agreed to pass a public option for health insurance as well as tuition-free college, and so far, he hasn't done either of those things. He promised to decriminalize recreational cannabis, he hasn't done that either. No, scheduling it down doesn't count, it's still a felony to possess. He also promised to pass a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill modeled loosely off of the Green New Deal. And when the time came to pass this legislation, he allowed 2 irrelevant senators from bumfuck Egypt to block and obstruct the bill. So instead, we got an incredibly watered-down version valued at $1.2 trillion with blatant privatization schemes written directly into it. Keep in mind that this is after the fact that the original $3.5 trillion bill was in and of itself a tiny drop in the bucket with respect to the amount of labor and investment that is actually needed in order to curtail our carbon footprint and reinvigorate our infrastructure and power grids. And while we're at it, let's take a look at some of the other anti-working class policies that have transpired under President Biden's tenure. In addition to failing to codify Roe v. Wade, directly going back on one of his major campaign promises and busting up the railway workers' strike, failing to deliver on any of the other progressive policies that he promised on the campaign trail such as tuition-free college or a public option, allowing 2 blue dog Democrats to cock-block his infrastructure bill and water it down to the point of being next to nothing, Biden has also allowed widespread austerity cutbacks to SNAP benefits, directly compromising food access for over 40 million food insecure Americans, has done absolutely nothing to combat the rampant rise of inflation, rents, and the general cost of living. He hasn't set any price controls on rents or done anything in terms of affordable housing. Instead, under Biden's economy, landlords can freely fleece their tenants unabated. Has given the fossil fuel industry virtually everything that it wants with zero pushback, maintaining taxpayer subsidies to these companies and allowing them to drill and frack as they please on government's land, despite telling voters otherwise. He cut 75% of unemployment benefits in an effort to force American workers to go back to work in the middle of a deadly pandemic, allowed the child tax credit to expire while doing next to nothing to have it reinstated, leading to a doubling of the rate of child poverty practically overnight. Turns out Biden would rather shrug his shoulders and blame Manchin for obstruction rather than putting up a meaningful fight to get it back. Has effectively declared the pandemic over and completely reopened up the economy. I find it funny how liberals roasted Trump for ignoring the virus for 2 months while it was here, when Biden is doing the exact same thing as we speak, with far more detrimental consequences. Has done absolutely nothing to protect the rights of trans people in states like Texas or Florida, effectively forcing many of them to have to relocate and uproot their entire lives just to get the medical care that they need. Has overseen one of the greatest bottom-up wealth transfers in the history of humanity, is actively sending billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine, is actively backing and enabling coups and the toppling of democratic governments abroad, is continuing to maintain the genocidal sanctions on Cuba and North Korea, is continuing to enable the Saudi genocide in Yemen, as well as the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians, is pushing for war with China over Taiwan. Let us now talk about Biden, the anti-racist. I remember around the time that Biden and Trump were running for the 2020 election, which was at the height of the BLM anti-racist protesting that was occurring nationwide in response to the unjust public execution of George Floyd, where there was this narrative that was being pushed by the Democrats and liberal partisans alike that Trump was the innately racist president and that Biden was somehow this principled anti-racist candidate who would stand up for the civil rights of racial minorities and bring an end to the uniquely evil racism that was transpiring under Republican rule. This narrative, of course, is a complete fabrication and total lie, as Joe Biden is still locking up indigenous children and asylum-seeking refugees in concentration camps at the border, despite the fact that this was one of his major selling points against Trump. Biden is still locking up children in cages. The media just isn't sensationalizing it like they were when Trump was president. Has deported more undocumented immigrants out of the country over the course of his tenure than Donald Trump ever has. As a matter of fact, while Biden was Obama's vice president, Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief owed to the sheer historic volumes of people that he was kicking out of the country. Boasts a historically high police budget as well as a historically high military budget. One of the major slogans of the BLM protests was to defund the police. Well, Biden has opted to increase funding to the police so that the cops are even more militarized and have even greater resources at their disposal to repress and oppress black and brown minorities. And it doesn't stop at the national stage, as the US military budget is also historically high, and as we're all aware, the US military exists to keep black and brown third world countries terrorized and subservient to the first world, imperialist West. Has done absolutely nothing to root out the rampant far-right extremism and white supremacy that is incredibly prolific amongst American police, let alone the FBI, the CIA, ICE, whom are also teeming to the brim with fascists and neo-Nazis. He wrote the crime bill and is the architect of a slew of other tough-on-crime legislation that was passed into law throughout the 1980s and 1990s, which is to this day utilized to profile, target, harass, and directly oppress black and brown communities throughout the US. This is something that everybody seemingly forgets, but there are hundreds of thousands of non-violent offenders who are rotting away in jail cells right now thanks to these arbitrary laws and penalties directly imposed upon them by legislation that was written by Joe Biden. He was a pro-segregationist piece of shit during the civil rights era, as at the onset of his political career he was a vocal opponent of busing, and he even got called out for it during the primaries by anti-racist champion Kamala Harris, who is coincidentally enough now Biden's vice president. I guess if you can't beat the racists, you may as well join them, huh, Kamala? Has utilized the FBI to arrest a group of black radicals for their anti-imperialist agitation against the ongoing proxy war with Russia. He voted for the war in Iraq and remained a vocal supporter of said war throughout President Bush's tenure, a war, mind you, which easily resulted in 1 million people dead, is a massive war hawk. In addition to the Iraq War, Biden also supported the bombing of Libya, the invasion of Afghanistan, America's involvement in regime change literally everywhere, and has recently threatened to impose sanctions on and even go to war with Niger and its allies in Africa. Continues to fund and provide material support to neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Last but not least, by virtue of letting the child tax credit expire, cutting unemployment benefits, cutting SNAP, and failing to carry out economic reform, Biden is by extension perpetuating white supremacy and structural violence towards people of color within the US, since as it turns out, the poorest people in the country are disproportionately black, Hispanic, and indigenous. So by imposing austerity on the people who need that economic support the most, he is by extension directly damaging these people and perpetuating their pauperization, marginalization, and oppression. So if you are a Biden supporter, if you vote Democrat, I want you to know that this is the person that you are willingly falling an allegiance behind. These are the policies and actions that they are carrying out, which in the grand scheme of things, can't really be called harm reduction considering the amount of damage that is actively being done to working people. And it can't really be called a compromise either, because that would imply actually enacting progressive policies that work to the benefit of workers at the expense of the capitalists. And that won't ever happen because, again, the Democrats are bought and paid for by the same people who buy and pay for the Republicans. Let's talk about this narrative that a vote for the Democrats is actually just a vote against fascism. That by voting for the Democrats, we can slow the rise of fascism and the prevalence of the far right here in the United States. Except for the part where that's not the way that this has ever worked, ever. Biden himself has commented on the need for a strong Republican opposition.
I think they understand that they're going to have to, we need a Republican Party. We need an opposition that's principled and strong.
But wait, he's the anti-fascist candidate, right? Why would the anti-fascist candidate be calling for a strong fascist opposition? Why wouldn't he want to destroy the fascist opposition if he is indeed anti-fascist? Instead, why is Biden vocally calling for the importance of a strong Republican right? Why is it that he has done nothing to root out the far right that is deeply entrenched within the ranks of our police forces and deep state institutions? Why has he historically and continuing to this day to uphold and support the aforementioned oppression of racial minorities while reinforcing the economic inequality that damages them the most? Why is it that when the people call to defund the police and the military, he does the exact reverse opposite? Why is it that the so-called anti-fascist party, which is supposed to be slowing the rise of the far right, appears to actually be accelerating its rise to prevalence by providing funding and direct material support to the electoral campaigns of far-right senators and politicians in various elections across the country? I have an answer to these questions, because the Democrats aren't actually anti-fascist. They are in fact fascist enablers. If they really wanted to, The Democrats could have had the Republican Party out of power a long time ago. All it would have taken is adopting the agenda of Bernie Sanders and carrying it out to a T. In doing so, they could have secured so much popular support that it would have been virtually impossible for the Republicans to stay relevant without also drastically changing their rhetoric to be more overtly progressive. And the proof is in the pudding. Back in 2016, when they collected national polling data in a hypothetical general election between Trump and Sanders, that Sanders averaged a 10-point lead over Donald Trump, with some polls showing as much as a 15-point lead over Donald Trump. So don't tell me that a Sanders-like candidate couldn't easily get elected. Bernie Sanders was filling stadiums full of young and enthusiastic supporters who not only turned out en masse to vote for him, but were volunteering left and right to assist him in his campaign. In this way, the Democrats could have primaried the Republicans in every election at both the state and federal level, sweeping the country under Democratic control, following up by immediately passing laws to make it harder to reverse said progressive agenda, as well as making it harder for Republicans to even win elections in the first place, and rendering the Republicans an irrelevant regional party that has no sway or influence at the national stage if they so desired. The reason why they don't do this, and why they never will do this, is twofold. For one, as I have mentioned earlier multiple times, both parties are bankrolled by the same class of wealthy oligarchs. So for the Democrats to enact anything resembling the Bernie Sanders agenda would have worked directly against the material interests of their donors. It would have alienated their donors, which would have resulted in a complete withdrawal of their campaign financing, and by extension their ability to run in elections. Why do you think Bernie Sanders had to raise all of his money from the grassroots, one $27 donation at a time? Here he is talking about regulating Wall Street, raising the taxes on the elite, downsizing our military, and carrying out a host of other policies that would directly undermine their profits and their power. This is exactly why they deliberately went out of their way to sabotage him in both elections. The second reason why the Democrats won't carry out progressive reform is because of the long-term implications that come with surrendering these concessions. Think about it. If the Democrats carried out these reforms and crushed the Republican Party like this, then the Overton window would shift drastically to the left. New conversations pertaining to how society should be reorganized will spontaneously erupt. All of a sudden, the Democrats are now the new right wing, and actual socialists become the new left wing. Under such a context, the Democrats wouldn't stand a chance in the long term without continuing to give in to progressive reforms, and by extension giving workers more and more political power and a greater seat at the table with respect to economic decision-making. The implications of this would spell death for the capitalist system in a few short decades. So instead, the Democrats utilize the Pied Piper strategy, by which they make their primary selling point the fact that they're not Republicans, that they're the lesser of two evils. And so what you're left with is a terminal political situation where the voters find themselves in a bad hostage situation at all times. And this isn't by accident, this is by design. The Democrats simultaneously block movement to the left while actively enabling the rise of these far-right Looney Tunes because they need the threat of fascism around in order to secure the election, while snubbing and turning their backs on the progressive constituency that they bullied, gaslit, fearmongered, and manipulated into turning out to vote for them in the first place. Unfortunately, this strategy has one fundamental flaw: the fact that it can and routinely does backfire on the Democrats. What happens when the far-right candidate being funded and enabled by the Democrats, whom wasn't supposed to win the election, ends up winning the election? You end up with a situation where, because the Democrats are so insufferable, because they're such deceptive sellouts that don't stand for anything, that think they're just owed and entitled to your vote, while on the other hand, you have this fascistic candidate who they are funding as controlled opposition, you end up with a situation where they inadvertently drive the voter turnout so low that it biases the election result in the favor of the reactionary candidate. And lo and behold, the Democrats, the so-called anti-fascist party that is supposed to be slowing the rise of fascism, ended up helping a far-right nutjob get elected to a position of power and authority. Anybody remember how Trump received billions of dollars in free media over the course of the 2016 and 2020 elections? Trump was supposed to be the ultimate boogeyman that would force people to turn out and vote for Hillary Clinton. But because of how contemptible and overtly narcissistic and insufferable that she is,
She lost the election to a failed steak merchant who is a known conman and fraud. And thanks to the Democrats and liberal establishment, we had 4 years of Donald Trump. And were it not for COVID and the stock market panic of 2020, we would have likely had 4 years more of him. This is the most important thing to take away from this essay, that the Democrats don't represent you. They represent the billionaires. All they're doing in paying lip service to progressive policy while giving you the ultimatum to vote for them or suffer under the Republicans is emotionally manipulating you for your vote. When you go to pull the lever, you're not doing so based on your own rational material interests, you're doing so because you have been terrorized, browbeaten, guilt-tripped, and gaslit into doing so. And whenever anybody tries to dare suggest that we vote and support working-class alternatives, they are immediately met with scorn, vitriolic contempt, and condescension. They are treated as though the Democrats are entitled to their votes and that they're the ones who are the problem for voting and supporting an alternative since they're throwing away their vote, allegedly, splitting the vote, so to speak, since that was a vote that could have gone against the Republicans. The voter is the one who gets blamed, not the Democrats, not the political party whose job it is to court our support and earn our vote by adequately representing us, but still failing to do so repeatedly. Nope, it's the individual voter for failing to turn out and to provide the Democrats with the support that they feel so entitled to. In this way, Democratic partisans are telling us that since third parties don't have sufficient support, that we shouldn't support them, and when they do have sufficient support, that we should still vote Democrat regardless because otherwise we're splitting the vote. And so to these people, we shouldn't think long-term and methodologically to build up a viable alternative over the years between elections to the point to where it has a real shot of seizing power. Instead, we need to put off the actual class struggle needed to build up that alternative into the indeterminate future since there's such a dire threat of fascism on the horizon, as though we as a country can't survive a few more terms under Republican rule. But I have a question for you Democratic loyalists and so-called progressives. At what point is harm reduction no longer a viable option? How long must we put off actual class struggle into the distant future so that we may instead grovel for scraps in the present? If now is not the right time to support a third party, when will the right time be? 10 years from now? In 20 years? 50 years? If the third party can't win because they lack support, then why don't you support them? And when they do have support, why are you among the first to accuse them of splitting the vote and voting Democrat anyways, as though we owe it to the Democrats to vote for them? I'm going to be totally honest and say that I genuinely don't give a fuck if we split the vote with the Republicans or not. I will take 20 years of Republican rule if it means building up that alternative power structure strong enough to contest both ruling parties for power and win. Because then we can go beyond harm reduction and instead carry out harm abolition. Keep in mind that our job as agitators and organizers tends to be much easier under Republican rule because we have a more clear-cut and well-defined enemy to agitate and organize against. With the Republicans, it's the devil you know. With the Democrats, you get two-faced serial gaslighters who pretend to be on your side before betraying you over and over again while running the country almost identically to the Republicans. If the US can survive hundreds of years of Republican rule in centuries past, then it can, in all likelihood, survive a few more years while we regroup and continue to build popular support for our party. It'll be worth the effort down the line, so why squander that over manufactured fear and outrage in the present? In doing so, you're playing directly into the hands of the Democrats' campaign strategy. The game that they are running is quintessential blackmail. They want you to be afraid, they want you to feel powerless, they want you to think that there is no alternative, and they want you to think that it is your fault if they don't win. Stop letting them blame and gaslight you. Responsibility falls onto the Democrats and the Democrats alone to secure the popular vote. And it is not the third party's fault if the Democrats failed the election because they lost out on said vote. The Democrats are not entitled to our support any more than the Republicans are, and liberals really need to stop working from the premise that they are. If the Democrats fail to get elected because they didn't secure adequate support, then they have no one to blame but themselves, and American voters are not the ones at fault for that. This is the equivalent of blaming individual consumers for climate change, when it is the big corporations ran and controlled by the autocratic private oligarchs that are the ones doing the lion's share of all of the polluting. Just imagine where the movement would be in 20 years if the same blue no matter who liberals put actual time, effort, and energy into building up a third-party alternative. Imagine if instead of selling out and squandering his momentum, that Bernie Sanders funneled all of his support and hundreds of millions of dollars in small campaign funds into a third party, say the Green Party, legitimizing them into a full-fledged working-class institution at the national stage. I'll tell you one thing, we would be in a much better position now than if we just kept voting blue, continuing to procrastinate on carrying out actual class struggle out of fear, and endlessly passing off our political responsibilities onto others and hoping that they will do all of the hard legwork for us. We've had literal centuries of periodic democratic rule, and we're not any closer to socialism now than we were under FDR's New Deal. Progressives will belabor the point that we should still vote Democrat because we can more easily pressure and pull Democratic politicians left than we can the Republicans, and yet they fail to realize that in order to do that you need actual leverage over them. No, standing around in free speech zones and holding up signs while you beg your oppressors to treat you with equality and make the right decisions does not count. Their hand has to be forced. This is why we need our own party, our own unions, our own working class institutions. If you don't have leverage, then you're not going to pull them left, they are going to pull you right. Just look at how much of these blue no matter who Democratic partisans who argued that we're going to bully Biden left immediately flipped the switch and started defending him after he went back on all of his promises and running apologetics for all of the horrible actions being carried out by his administration. How about when AOC and the Squad finally secured their positions in the White House, and despite single-payer healthcare being a central point on their agenda, they proceeded to completely shit the bed and fail to place any pressure on Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats during the whole force the vote debacle. I understand you pragmatic Chomskyite types think that this would have been pointless and that AOC would have lost her job if she did this, but it would have made for such excellent propaganda. And it goes back to the point I made earlier. If now isn't the proper time to fight for real working class interests, when will it be? Why are you waiting for some arbitrary correct moments to do what is right? Imagine telling the civil rights leaders of the 1960s that now is not the correct time to fight for the rights of the marginalized. But the funny thing is, that's exactly what these liberals would be doing if they were alive and around during that context. We need a party of our own with infrastructure of its own that operates independently of the Democrats. This is something that historically happens constantly and is a tried and true method that has stood the test of time. If we look to Latin America as an example, we can see that third parties have fought and succeeded in winning elections and seizing state power in countries residing across the continents throughout the decades, from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, to Salvador Allende in Chile, to João Goulart in Brazil, to Jaime Aguilera in Ecuador, to Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, to Evo Morales in Bolivia, to numerous other leftist parties and candidates who have fought and won elections wherever and whenever they took place. Of course, it usually isn't just the party in many of these instances, it's the party with additional support from the trade unions, student unions, and various working class organizations formed from the grassroots. Historically, trade unions have been incredibly successful in wresting concessions from the ruling class time and time again. Looking back to a recent example previously mentioned, had the railway workers went ahead and carried out their strike regardless of legality, they would have paralyzed the supply chain, and there would have been absolutely nothing that the government or the railway bosses could have done to stop it. In such a situation, the railway companies and the politicians that represent them would have had no choice but to capitulate and give in to their demands. But instead, because they did not fight, they did not win. Let me make it clear that simply winning elections should not be our primary goal. We should not be exclusively striving for bourgeois legitimacy and limiting ourselves to the forms of resistance that the ruling class deems as acceptable. Your oppressors will never give you permission to fight them and will demonize you for even trying. In order for the working class to win, it's going to need to operate outside of the boundaries of the law to a significant extent. And after a certain point, we won't have a choice but to operate outside said boundaries because when we grow big and influential enough, the ruling class is going to criminalize our party and activities and unleash the state to repress us. It's not a matter of if, but when. And when that day comes, we need to continue our efforts regardless underground, and use the state's targeted violence against us as agitation and propaganda to further cultivate popular sympathy and support. Liberals don't seem to understand that when figures that they idolize, such as Martin Luther King and Gandhi, speak of peaceful resistance, they weren't talking about standing around in free speech zones and holding up signs and chanting slogans. They were talking about directly breaking the law through civil disobedience. Again, on the railway workers, Biden outlawed the strike, and yet the strike was the #1 tool that the railway workers had at their disposal to get what they wanted. So who gives a damn if they were breaking the law at that point? Why are we treating the bourgeois legal apparatus with all this undeserved legitimacy when the legal system clearly doesn't represent us? And the US government is completely unworthy of that legitimacy in the first place. Keep in mind that this is a government formed for and by wealthy autocrats on stolen land that routinely exploits its own domestic population while enabling and carrying out even worse forms of exploitation and oppression across the globe. And so to round things off, let me make it clear that the Pied Piper strategy is all that the Democrats have. They have nothing else for us. They can't raise wages, they can't get us free healthcare or education, they can't pass the infrastructure bills that they want without letting a handful of irrelevant senators neuter it, they can't do anything about sky-high rents or the cost of living, and yet they act so entitled to our votes and support. Why? Just because the Republicans are more overtly reactionary than they are? Fuck that. If we don't break away from the two-party duopoly now and start working and organizing on our own terms, the situation is only going to continue to get darker. So stop putting your confidence in these little politicians and passing off your political responsibility onto people that don't give a damn about you. Stop letting them manipulate you. Stop letting them blackmail you. Stop believing in their false promises and stop buying into their lies. The Democrats are your enemy, and the sheepdog progressives that they keep around, like Sanders and Turner, are actively collaborating with your class enemy. They will be kept around on a leash, but they will never be allowed to win because that's not the point. The point is to trick gullible, naive young voters with real grievances into supporting the Democrats, and then trapping them within the confines of a political machine designed to rein them in, instill hopelessness and fear, along with defanging and de-radicalizing them, and turning them into moderates. If you really want to make a difference, here are some things that you can do instead. Get involved in your local political arena in some meaningful capacity. See what your local left looks like. See what your local class struggle looks like. If you're not in a socialist org, join one. Where there is none, start one. If there's a DSA chapter in your area doing some good work on the ground, then irrespective of how you feel about their leadership, you should get involved because these are the people you have to work with. Try starting a union at your job. If you live in an apartment complex, try getting your neighbors in and starting a tenants union. Start participating in local elections and running your own working-class candidates. Everyone is so focused on the presidency that they forget that there are positions of power within their local areas that have direct impact over your lives. And hell, if you have the aptitude for it, consider running for mayor or local office yourself. And on the question of the presidential election, stop voting for the Democrats, for Christ's sake! There is a perfectly good Green Party and PSL that you could be casting your vote towards. Now, don't get me wrong, I have my grievances with both of those organizations, but for now I'm going to set that aside. Try kicking off a mutual aid group or a communal diner in your area. Find ways to bring people together. Meet them where they are, figure out what their issues are and what matters to them, and make appeals to them based on their issues. You would be surprised the sheer volume of working people under the age of 35 that heavily resonate with socialist rhetoric. And as capitalism crumbles, as the contradictions intensify, as the inherent cruelty and inhumanity of the system becomes increasingly laid bare, the logic for a new system will become obvious to more and more people over time. And so our job as agitators and organizers should get easier as the years go on. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening.